This is Journeyverse, Journeys, Part 12. A planet. Somewhere. Later. Xander remained silent in his perch, asking himself once again how he'd managed to get himself into this mess. By his best calculations, he had been hunting with Rucha for over a month, but he figured that only because he thought that he had probably slept about 30 times or so, not counting cat naps. In truth, it was probably longer than that, since the Yucha didn't seem to sleep as often, or as long as humans tended to, and he'd been forced to adapt to their timetable. That alone had been hell for the first couple of weeks or so. It had been a rough relationship in the beginning. Xander didn't really have much use for hunting, and it seemed that was all Rucha did have time for. If it weren't for the big Yucha's respect for the hyena, Xander figured that he'd already be a decoration in the ship's trophy room. The 17-year-old shuddered. The trophy room was enough to give him nightmares on his nightmares. Skulls from a dozen species littered the room, a fair portion of which were human. Only his sense of self-preservation and Elan's calming words allowed him to keep his cool after a single trip to that room. After that confrontation, Rucha seemed to question his strength, fortitude. That caused another shudder. He had to resort to bluster and bluff to work his way out of that one. He all but challenged the bastard to a fight. He'd never been so relieved when Rucha broke out in laughing appreciation of his actions. Yende, the big alien laughed and clapped Xander on the back. If I ever get back to Earth, there's no way in hell that any fucking vamp is gonna scare me again. Maybe 3 weeks ago they had arrived on planet. Nice place to visit, Xander had thought at the time. Now he knew better. The damn place was infested with creatures that made the demons look warm and cuddly. Xander remembered the second day after they had arrived and shuddered again at the thought. 3 weeks earlier. The planet looked like a lush tropical jungle as far as he could see. Hell, it looked the same as far as he could see from orbit when they landed. This was the second planet they had visited in the time Xander had been traveling with the Elder Yucha. They had just left a world less than a day earlier that for some reason didn't satisfy the Yucha's desire. No surprise there, Xander shivered. The damn world seemed to be in a freaking glacial age. Kiende Ameda. Xander turned in confusion. He'd been piecing together words here and there a lot faster than he would have thought possible, but those words were not part of his vocabulary. What? Kende amede, setgin. Now that was a word he caught. Setgin. Fast and dangerous. Shit. I so don't want to see what he thinks is dangerous. Xander's wearing a light padded armor that Rutha had given him. He doubted that would provide him with much protection, but it had kept him warm in the ice cube they had just left. Other than that, however, he was packing the same gear that he had come on board with. He glanced at the combat armor the big alien was wearing with some envy. I don't suppose you have any idea what those words mean, do you, Elen? Xander almost smirked at the annoyance in her voice when she replied. Would you please use my proper name? And to answer your question, no. I told you I have very little experience with the Yucha language. They did not approach Earth during my day. Xander sighed, accepting the answer. Again. They headed out into the jungle, the big Yucha remaining in the jungle floor out of tolerance for Xander's limitations, though Xander didn't figure that would last for much longer. The big guy seemed to be a big believer in the sink or swim philosophy. Rutha walked along beside Xander, pointing out things in the jungle quickly and quietly as they passed them. Most of it went over the boy's head, but he managed to pick up what he considered the most important. Don't eat this, poison, don't touch that, dangerous, and so forth. They had traveled perhaps a mile when Rutha stopped them and ran one of his wrist blades along the length of a tree. Tedikwe. Another word Xander hadn't heard. He was about to ask when Rutha went to a battle alert, snapping Xander into combat stance as well. The twin colts cleared leather as he tracked along the path Rutha was looking. 6 of the ugliest things Xander had ever seen, Rutha included, were charging towards them, with absolute disregard for subtlety. Uther fired his plasma cannon from 50 yards, and Xander opened up an instant later. The first of the black creatures fell to Uther's plasma cannon, then a second. It wasn't until Xander had emptied both magazines into one of them that it staggered and fell. The other three soon closed within the plasma caster's minimum distance, causing Uther to draw his warstaff. Xander popped the remaining bullets from his magazine into the lead creature, before tossing the handguns to either side and whipping Elan from her sheath. Xander and Uther stood side by side as two healthy creatures charged past the one Xander had wounded, each selecting one of the two defenders to charge. Xander stood his ground, bracing Elan along his arm, and waited. He could hear Uther growling in excitement, or laughter. He wasn't really sure which. They waited for the two things to get less than 3 feet away before the two defenders struck. Uther thrust forward with its combi stick, skewering the creature with a fluid grace. Xander activated Elan at the last possible instant, the force of the weapon activation sending the end of the staff through the creature's outer shell that covered this. Xander winced at the hard shriek that sounded through the air, as the two things were injured, but withdrew the staff in a vicious arc that caved the creature's skull at the point where the weapon had damaged the carapace, dropping it to the ground. Xander panted, the battle tension still riding high in him as he turned to look at Uther. For some reason he didn't fathom, the wounded creature had elected to team up with the one attacking Yucha, and while they were both wounded, they were still mobile to a certain degree. Xander moved to the big Yucha's side, using Elan to fend off one of the things in Uther's right side. When his arm was freed, the big Yucha extended the claws from his wrist and slashed at the one on his left side, ripping its throat in one swipe. He turned to see Xander, fending off the other one with his staff, and laughed in appreciation of the spectacle. "Hey, a little help here?" Xander muttered, between pants as he battled the creature's claws away again. Finally, he managed to land a solid blow to the creature's jaw, actually ripping a large section of it off and dropping the thing to the ground. His soldier instincts took over, and he thrust Elan down into the creature, finally stilling its horrid screams. Leaning heavily on Elan, Xander panted and looked at the fallen creature in distaste. He leaned forward to touch one, when Uther grabbed his arm back, speaking urgently. "Take it away, Thue." Xander looked down at the creature, then at the place their blood had landed. Wherever it had touched, a wisp of smoke was rising, and even the ground itself was being eaten away. Theada, Dua. Deathblood, indeed. Xander shivered. What kind of hellhole is this place? Present time. Xander shivered again at the memory. Damn creatures were as dangerous dead as they were alive. He'd never thought it was possible to find a species he found more vile than vampires. But things were on a whole different level. Like the vamps, they were parasites. Their entire existence depended on their other species as a host. Another shudder passed through him as he remembered the scene in the lair that they had tracked the creatures to. Some of the local primates had been stuck to the walls by what Uther called Tedgue, and were writhing in terror as they passed. Xander had moved to help them loose, but the big Yucha had pulled him back urgently. Xander didn't think that he'd ever be able to lose nightmares of what followed. Those things as they burst. He shook his head, clearing the memories before they could be flooded back. Xander wasn't stupid, and with the information he could recall from the soldier and the ever-so-helpful input from Elan, he knew that he wasn't, well. Shell shock, post-traumatic stress disorder. It was a weird thing being on this side of the line. He'd seen so much and pulled through in the past few years that he started to think that nothing could faze him. And of course, as soon as he thought that, he was screwed. Then again, Xander mused, is it possible to have shell shock if you know you have it? He shrugged it off. Maybe it's not shell shock. Maybe I'm just becoming jaded. Halliwell Manor House, San Francisco, California, August 23rd, 1999. Prue walked into the attic to find her younger sister sitting and staring at a bowl of water, a melancholy look on her face. "What's wrong, Phoebe?" Prue's voice was filled with concern. "I'm worried about Xander. Phoebe answered. He hasn't been answering any of my emails, so I cast a divining spell to find him. And? Nothing. Phoebe's eyes were coated with a glistening sheen of tears. Nothing at all. He's dead? Prue asked tentatively. No, Phoebe was certain. If he was dead, or had left this plane, it would show as a specific color. Black, white, or a shade of gray. What did it show? Prue asked. I told you, nothing. How is that possible? Did you do the spell wrong? Phoebe cradled the Book of Shadows. I don't think so. It says in here that when the subject of the spell is nearby, the color shifts closer to the blue, being as its deepest if the person is in the same room. The further they are away, the more it shifts to red. Yellowish orange is the highest color listed, and that's for some place in China. Prue wasn't following. Phoebe stared at the divining bowl for a long moment. The only thing I can think of is that the color shifted into the infrared. Prue stared at her little sister in shock. How far away would he have to be for that to happen? I don't know. Present time. He couldn't see Rutha from his position, but he knew that the elder Yucha was out there, watching. Xander did a quick inventory again, checking his equipment with trepidation. The big Yucha had insisted that Xander leave his pistols behind, as he himself left the plasma caster at the ship. The best Ilan had to say about it, that it was probably a ritual hunt of some sort, a test of courage. On the bright side, Xander had been afforded some ill-fitting armor that had actually seemed useful. At least it's not a suicide test of some sort. He looked over the scene from his perch, 30 feet above the jungle floor, watching the comings and goings of the beasts below through the eerie heat vision the armor's mask provided. From what he could tell, that option was nearly useless when tracking the things that were hunting. But as long as the area teemed with the normal life, it was a safe bet that those things weren't anywhere to be found. For the 100th time in an hour, Xander sighed. This wasn't like him at all, and he knew it. The last thing he wanted to do was hunt anything, with the possible exception of vampires. These creatures, though, were a plague, at least as bad as vampires. Though for some reasons, and he sighed again, since I'm here, it was at that point that he saw the rapid scattering of the heat signs below, a sure indication that a local predator was on the prowl. He quickly scanned the area, and seeing nothing, switched the helm's heat register off, and replied in his own eyes, as much as the equipment would let him. Rutho watched as the human shifted the visual spectrum on his gear, nodding at the move. The kind Ahmed were in the area, and the trial would shortly begin. The old Yucha had enjoyed the time he'd spent with the young human, even finding the human's constant chattering and joking to be amusing. He wondered often if the human would ever realize that he could understand many more languages than the human could guess at, and that English was one of the more recent ones he had learned. He growled in laughter at the thought. Any of the young warriors would have killed the boy when he blacked out, but Ruth had grown bored over the centuries. It was occasionally interesting to hunt alongside one who was normally be prey, particularly if he was a Yeyend, as this one was. If he survived this, he would be blooded, though he would never be a true hunter. He was too much of a kind Ind. The things moved slowly beneath him, slowly and warily. Xander wondered how smart they really were from time to time over the past 3 weeks. They were pretty stupid individually, but they were often capable of acting together, with a cleverness that put most vamps Xander had known to shame. Still, they might have been Patton himself, and it wouldn't have saved this group. Xander dropped from the trees, landed squarely in the center of the trio of beasts. He lined up the collapsed staff with 2 of the creatures and activated the ancient weapon, penetrating both alien skulls as they turned to hiss at him. Christ. 3 weeks of sink or swim changes you damn fast. Rutha had made it quite clear that Xander had to fight or die early on, and Xander had a very healthy desire for life. He retracted a line as the 2 creatures fell, and whipped the battle staff around to connect with the third as it charged him. Not for the first time, he thanked whatever god there was that the land was not only impervious to the alien's acid, but also seemed to cause it to slide off like water off a non-stick frying pan. Well, I could very hardly be indestructible if I allowed every dime store acid and lava pool to tarnish my surface, now would I? Less mid-battle chatter, Elan, more carnage. Xander jammed the staff into the creature as it lunged, dropping back into a roll, flipping the horror into the jungle behind him. He rolled over to his front and climbed quickly to his feet as he watched for the creature to return. When it did, it struck at him from his right flank, ramming into him hard enough to jolt Elan from his grasp and drive him to the ground in a tangle of claws and limbs. "Son of a—" Xander muttered through his mask as he hit the ground, a hissing and screaming creature clawing at his armored form. Rutha watched the human's opening move and growled in appreciation. It was smooth, brutal, and effective. He hadn't seen better in a long time, even among the Yucha. He almost regretted not killing the human and taking his staff as a trophy, but he doubted the thing would operate for him anyways. He was old enough to remember the stories of when others wielded these weapons, and weapons of similar power. Old enough to have been glad that those days were gone. The wielders of those weapons were kind. Like the human, they didn't approve of the hunt, and they were able to enforce their will. Now, though, he was not so sure. If the kind returned, then they would make it for worthy prey. Rutha watched the boy struggle with the kind Ahmad, with a growing excitement. With luck, there would be worthy times ahead. Xander slowly forced the creature's claws back away from his mask, and lashed out with as powerful a kick as he could muster. It did nothing more than push the creature back a few feet, but that allowed him to pull his heavy-bladed machete from its sheath and flip back to his feet. Xander and the alien circled each other warily, looking for any opening to exploit. The alien moved first, swiping at Xander's blade arm as he lunged in. Hissing, Xander danced back from the swipe, and then moved forward to meet the creature's lunge. The two combatants met, face to mouth, war cries erupting from them both as they clashed. When the creature's mouth opened, Xander was waiting, his machete already slashing across the predictable path of the inner mandible, slicing it and spattering acid through the air. The creature drew back in pain as the mandible dropped to the ground, and Xander pressed his advantage. He swept the smoking blade down in an overhead strike that ended with the remnants of the once heavy blade buried deep in the creature's black carapace. As the thing finally dropped to the jungle floor, Xander quickly grabbed up Elan, and looking around for any others that might have approached. Seeing none, he looked back down at the last alien, and pulled the machete clear of its skull. He slowly turned the misshapen blade, and watched as the metal smoked and dissolved before his eyes. He suddenly hissed in pain as the back of his neck burned. Scrabbling at the armor, he pulled it off, only to see that a few splatters of acid had eaten through the neck guard and eventually reached his skin. His hand was stopped, inches from attempting to wipe it off, by the big fist of Rutha, who nodded down at the shorter human in respect and applied a counter-agent to the acid on the boy's neck. Xander sighed as the cooling sensation spread, easing the pain. Then he moaned at the realization that it was certainly going to leave a scar. I really want to go home and only have to worry about vampires and the occasional demon.